Good evening and welcome to our webinar. This is the collaboration between uh, the Army Heritage Center Foundation, Mount Vernon, and Grinnell College. My name is Jeff Hawks. I'm the Director of Education and Veterans Outreach for the Army Heritage Center Foundation, and I'm very glad that you've all joined us here this evening. At the end of the program, I'll take a few minutes to tell you a little bit more about the Army Heritage Center Foundation. We are the sponsors for National History Day in Pennsylvania, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that too. But for now, let me please introduce our panelists, Dr. Sarah Purcell and Ms. Sadie Troy. So if you, ladies, you take a moment and introduce yourself, starting with Dr. Purcell.
Hi, everyone. Nice to have you here. I'm Sarah Purcell. I'm a professor of history at Grinnell College in Grinnell, Iowa. And I do frequent programs for the George Washington's Teachers Institute at Mount Vernon and a lot of other K through 12 programs. I am a specialist in 18th and 19th century U.S. history. And I've written a number of books, but maybe most significantly for our purposes, excuse me, Sealed with Blood: War, Sacrifice, and Memory in Revolutionary America. And I'm very, very interested in the founders and in Pennsylvania history and all kinds of other things. So I look forward to your questions. I welcome your questions as we get to know each other.
Hi, I'll go next. Hi, everyone. My name is Sadie Troy. I am the manager for student learning at George Washington's Mount Vernon. I'm like disappearing into the background, I feel like, as we go here. But I am so excited to talk with you all and be here for this workshop. I'm so happy that we're able to co-sponsor it. Mount Vernon, whether you are here because you teach and utilize National History Day within your classroom or not, so excited to talk to you guys. We are big, big, big supporters at Mount Vernon of National History Day and figuring out different ways where we can bring that scholarship, that content, and especially those trusted sources, those primary sources to teachers that can filter down to their students, whether they're researching for National History Day or for other projects throughout the year. And so that's really where this collaboration came about. And really happy to have you all here after a long day at work, after probably what's turning into crazy weeks, because how many more days till Thanksgiving break, right? We're all getting so close, but super excited to have you here.
Wonderful, thank you. So we're going to begin. Sadie is going to tell us a little bit about George Washington as colonel in the Virginia Regiment. If you have questions, I'm sure you're all familiar with Zoom by now. But if you're not, you'll see on your toolbar at the bottom of the screen the Q&A button. If you have a question that you want to ask, go ahead and type it there, and we'll get those questions to the panelists for you. All right, Sadie, please.
Yeah, awesome. So I'm going to take over for this first little bit and just do a nice little introduction and then bounce it over to Sarah, who's really going to help us dive deep into the content. Let's see if I can pull up my screen here. Okay, hopefully you all can all see that. And I just want to say, so I'm happy to send this PowerPoint out to everybody. You can see the QR code. That'll pull up my PowerPoint into whatever you use. You can use that short link. You can write it and take it. All of these images that I'm using in my PowerPoint are free to copy, to steal, and all of them are hyperlinked. So you are also able to just go directly to the source that they're here. But as you guys saw when you registered, the theme we wanted to go with for this, was Washington and the Pennsylvania frontier. And we really wanted to look at Washington and that frontier, both pre and post the American Revolution, because with Washington, that idea of the frontier was really vital and important to his life. And it matches so wonderfully with that National History Day theme this year of frontiers and history. Okay, and so in order to get us started, before we kick it over to Dr. Purcell, who's going to come the content I really wanted to just kind of put us in the moment to really think about Washington in that pre-revolutionary viewpoint that he has of that frontier, right? So getting into the mindset and really kind of using just a nice little quick visual analysis to just start our brains going, and put us in that mindset of thinking about Washington on that frontier before the American Revolution. So I just thought I'd put up this image to have you guys all observe and just kind of take a couple seconds to look at it. And I'm going to pull up my Q&A in case you'd like to answer any of the questions I'm asking. You can throw it in the Q&A, but you can also just think about these to yourself. Because as we take a deeper dive into this portrait, why is my screen? I'm going to move it over a little. I just want us to think of answers to these easy questions. So looking at Washington in this outfit, right, in this uniform that we don't really see him, what are things that Washington might feel when wearing this outfit? What are things at this time in his life? What are things that this person in this outfit is going to observe, right? So this whole thinking routine is to just help us think of new perspectives as we look at the subject of this portrait. So who is this person and what might they feel? What might they observe? What are different things that they're seeing in this earlier time that Washington is thinking about in this earlier time? I'm looking at it too. So, right. Is he observing lands he's never seen before? Is he following, different instructions from the British monarchy that's coming down through Parliament to him? What are different things he's feeling? What are different things he knows about, right? So this person, this view of Washington, what are things that he might know? If we think about his past that helped him get through the French and Indian War, he knows about surveying. He knows about map making and looking at the land and kind of being able to tell stories about the land. I'm having some really great things popping into the Q&A, which I'm loving. Right? Like he was a surveyor, so he traveled the land. He probably knew a lot about Pennsylvania, right? He knew about the route coming and going. Absolutely. Another one that we can pull in, what might this person care about? And I really like this one to think about in this painting that Washington had done in this fancy uniform that he has with all of the symbols of his rank. What does it show that he cares about? Elizabeth in the chat mentioned that, she has her students look at this portrait because when it was painted, it may have been assuming it would be the only one he ever painted of him. And that's such a good thought. So what are the important things that he's putting in there? What are the things that he's caring about in this moment, right? As he's having this portrait done in this early time in his life. So there are a lot of different things, a lot of just different. I just wanted us to get in this perspective of thinking about the views that Washington has as that British subject, fighting in that French and Indian War, being a part, right, of that regiment that maybe comes to change later.
Sadie, I think one person had a hand raised, but I don't know.
Oh.
Was it someone named Judy?
Oh, yeah. Can you type in a Q&A? Sorry, how do I call on somebody? I don't use Zoom. Mount Vernon is a little outdated. We use WebEx, so I'm new to this.
Judy, I'm going to ask you if you can go ahead and type your question either in the Q&A or in the chat box. If you put it in the Q&A, I'll transfer it to the chat box for everyone to see.
Yeah, just thinking about, that's great. Okay, and while she's typing that, hey.
Sadie, I'm going to say one question that thought that he might care about in this. He's probably thinking about service to the king.
Absolutely, right? He's absolutely thinking about service to the king and his work for the British monarchy, right? And his service to them. It's a big Elizabeth was going to point out that the portrait was painted 20 years after his military service. So he has time to reflect on it, which also shows kind of how important that military service was. Whoops, hold on. I did the wrong thing. Okay. But I wanted to show, just kind of get us in this quick mindset before passing it on, and use this routine that I borrowed from Harvard Project Zero. I don't know if anyone uses this out there, but it's a great resource where the Harvard School of Education put together quick little thinking routines between 2, 3, and 5 questions to really be utilized again and again, right? That idea of the routine, but they're here to bring about different skills forward. There are analysis ones. This one is looking at different perspectives and being able to step inside and figure out different viewpoints that we can pull from different images. Okay. And I'm seeing a couple other things pop in, but now that we kind of have this idea, we've structured ourselves thinking about what Washington's thinking about on the Pennsylvania frontier that he knows a lot about from his time as a surveyor and working his way up through the ranks. It's a really great time to switch over. And now that we have this little bit of a mindset, Dr. Purcell can take us forward and dive deeper into that content. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that she can share hers.
Excellent. How's that? Can everybody see that okay? And
yes, we can.
Excellent. Great. Well, like I said, I'm so happy to be here talking with you all today. So I'm going to follow up on this theme that Sadie introduced, George Washington and frontier. And I really want to look at the way that interactions on the frontier before and after the Revolution helped to shape George Washington and a little bit of his impact, especially on the Pennsylvania frontier. And I'm going to look at that from a number of different angles. I really, like I said, my name is Sarah Purcell, and I'm from Grinnell College in Grinnell, Iowa. I definitely welcome questions. So Jeff's going to monitor the chat. Please type questions if you have them. And Jeff, feel free to interrupt me to ask a question, because I'd like this to be interactive if possible. Okay. I will also have time for questions at the end. So if you do want to just like go with the flow, then you can save time for questions at the end. I also put my email there on the screen. It's purcell@grinnell.edu. And Jeff and Sadie will both have that afterwards, or take a screenshot of that. Feel free to send me an email if you'd like some resources or you want to know more about any of the topics that I mentioned. I'm very, very happy to share ideas and share resources. Excuse me.
All right. First question already is about sharing your PowerPoint. So we can make this available to everyone after the presentation? Yes, it should be fine. And I think all but one possibly of my images are also open source or out of copyright, as Sadie was saying. And I do have, there's only one that was missing, and you'll see it in I put the credits for the images in the presenter notes. So you'll see what the credits are and some links where you can go there. So yes, great question. And this one is clip art, so you can just use that from Dover clip art. So so we're going to look at how frontier action shaped Washington. First in the case of the 7 Years' War, and then we're going to shift and talk about the Whiskey Rebellion and the Pennsylvania frontier. So we're looking at a very similar geographic space. And that's something I wanted to emphasize, is that frontiers are these liminal areas between and betwixt one thing and another. Sometimes we think of them as, we view them from the perspective of an established society, but we also can view them from lots of other perspectives spatially. So frontiers are more about the space in between. And that space in between is going to be a space in the 18th century that is rife for conflict, because frontiers are areas where, especially in the 18th century,
there is perhaps a question mark about the authority that controls frontiers. Who is it that has the authority to keep the peace? That's one of the big questions about frontiers, and especially the Pennsylvania frontier in the 18th century, from the period of 1750 to 1800, which is roughly the period that we're going to look at today. And so this question about frontiers is a question about space. It's a question about the way people interacted with each other. And it's a question about authority. So those interactions take the form of military interactions, of government touch points, of things like surveying land that you all mentioned in Sadie's lead-in, and the way that people interacted with space and with one another and with institutions that became the authority of a shifting government power on the North American continent. And all of those things are going to be important. And I think all of those could make good student projects. If you looked at a frontier as a place for human interaction, or as a place where violence was a possibility, as a place where authority was being negotiated and renegotiated throughout the 18th century. And that's a concept that some historians, Richard White and other historians, have used to talk about multiple frontiers in multiple locations, lots of different global histories of frontiers. So you could apply that idea of the frontier, whether you're talking about frontiers in modern China or whether you're looking at frontiers in Pennsylvania in the 18th century, to kind of think about the meaning of the frontier. And so to use this lens of how the Pennsylvania frontier and frontier actions influenced George Washington. Now, to us, we know in the 21st century that Washington was an incredibly important, influential, and powerful figure. That's where he ended up in the 1790s that we'll see. That he already was someone with great authority and with a position in society, but it wasn't really clear that he was going to be someone with power in the 1750s. And so frontiers had something to do with his own self-definition and with the way he thought of himself in relation to larger questions like empire and authority, and even the US Constitution, as we're going to see. So that's really what we're going to look at. In addition to the ways Washington's own view on military power was shaped by actions on the frontier. So just kind of ask this question about how a multifaceted frontier shaped Washington, first as a young man and then as a president. And that's what we're going to look at. So first, we're going to look at the period of the 7 Years' War. I really love this map of the 7 Years' War, which I actually took from Wikipedia, which you'll see, which, as we know, is a great teaching resource a lot of times. So I love this map because it really dramatizes the 15 to 20 years before the actual American Revolution. Is a whole series of globalized events. And the 7 Years' War is really a global event, one that reached across many continents, north and south, east and west. And it puts our notion of the Pennsylvania frontier, or just the frontier conflict, and you can see it on this map where the blue and the green meet each other in North America there, in the southern part. Like, that's the frontier we're going to zone in on. But it's not the only space that we might be able to look at, but it is the space where George Washington was inhabiting. It's important to think about, I think, frontiers as specific locations within this larger global story of the 7 Years' War. And in fact, it's pretty important because it's part of a series of world-scale wars for empire between France and England, right? And mostly they began in Europe in the previous decades before the 7 Years' War. But in this case, this phase of this global war for empire between France and Britain actually started in America. And it started with George Washington. It started around George Washington. And we're going to see how, in this case, actions on the Pennsylvania frontier spread into another global scale war between Britain and France, and involved, of course, native indigenous nations in North America, hence the name of the war in North America, the French and Indian War, right? But the 7 Years' War is more the European name for the war, which shows you something about the global situation. Well, we'll get back to Washington here in a minute, but I wanted to just show you this this map, which shows you a little bit about before 1754, which is the beginning of the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War. And then in 1763, sort of what are the relative, let's zone in on that frontier area that I was talking about as part of this larger global empire. That you can see this whole line between the French and the British. And in the area of Pennsylvania, Ohio frontier, sometimes called the French Crescent in the 1750s, that notion that the French settlement and areas of authority wrapped around and kind of hemmed the British Empire in against the coast. So one reason that that this is even considered a frontier is because the French had expanded their power through North America through alliances with native nations and through the building of trading. And they had, in a sense, established a vast area over which they had trade relations and a loose kind of government authority. It proposed a greater challenge to the British Empire because it hemmed them in against the Atlantic Ocean. And it frustrated not only expansionist ideas of the British Empire, but it frustrated actual American colonists who wanted to find new land opportunities and who were increasingly moving into frontier areas. At the same time, if you view it from the French side or from the natives on the French side, you would see that the frontier was an area they were hoping to preserve, and they were looking to preserve alliances that they saw the British as threatening, and they saw the British North American colonists as encroaching upon lands and authority that were fairly well established before 1754. So I just wanted to show you this map, this 1754 map, to show you that you could view the frontier from multiple sides, multiple perspectives. One of my favorite books on Native American history is called Facing East from Indian Country, just to remind us that it's not this inexorable story of westward expansion at all times in all places, and you can actually tell the story from multiple perspectives. We are interested, however, in the perspective not just of George Washington, but perspectives about George Washington. And in this war, he is one of the main actors and kind of the the match that helps to light the conflict of the 7 Years' War and the whole French and Indian War at this time. So the British were pushing further west from their perspective. The French are there in the French Crescent. And basically, the Ohio Company and the area around present-day Pittsburgh, right, the Monongahela area, is an area in which the British and the French have rival claims to. Okay, so there are multiple points of authority. If we go even further, I think this can show us Indian nations and French and Indian war forts, 1754 to 1760. So this gives you the key. And again, this will be in my slides, so you can zoom in on any part of this that you want to look at, right? But if you zoom in, you can kind of see that there are multiple peoples, and it doesn't show you too much. It doesn't get like as specific, but we have both the Delaware and the Shawnee. There are Mingo groups who are mixed groups. So you could view it. I love this because it shows you it's not just the French butt up against the English territory, but also disputed territory in the middle. And it's disputed between the British and the French and with their allies. And mostly in the 1750s, the French were aligned with the Delaware and most of the Shawnee. And one of the things George Washington is going to take away from this is the intense need to communicate or dominate Native allies and to cement some kind of position vis-a-vis these Native nations, because he comes to understand through the French and Indian War that it is not possible to just dominate disputed territory without either making alliances or conquering or doing something in relation to Native peoples. Okay, so you see what I'm getting at. It's a multi-part frontier, and the disputed territory has multiple disputes, even within that. So that's important to remember. So we'll go back to George here. Same portrait. So in 1754, George Washington, because he was a surveyor, as you pointed out, who was 22 years old at the time, and a member of the Virginia militia, he was someone who certainly was, as I said, a prominent citizen of the colony of Virginia. He was the younger son in the Washington family, not yet inherited Mount Vernon from his older brother. But he was someone from a very prominent and wealthy family. He was just starting to come up in the world and kind of make his own name. But as by virtue of being a member of an elite family in Virginia, albeit born in Virginia, he wasn't on the level of British aristocracy, but he was someone who, for instance, was appointed to be an officer in the Virginia militia, even though he was only 22. And we can tell, as you said, from 20 years later, he's still very proud of his Virginia militia uniform that you see here, painting himself 20 years afterwards having himself painted, commissioning a portrait of himself in his Virginia militia uniform. He identified with the colony of Virginia, with the leadership of Virginia, and with the idea that he would be able to exercise authority for the colony of Virginia and by proxy for the British Empire. So he felt himself very much a part of the British Empire. And this uniform is part of that. It communicates his position as an individual and his ability to kind of encapsulate the authority of the British Empire. So Governor Dinwiddie commissioned Washington to go on an expedition into the Pennsylvania frontier, as I said, especially into the area, near present-day Pittsburgh. And he leads a detachment of Virginia militia into Western Pennsylvania. Along with this group are some native allies that from the Mingo, as I mentioned, that Washington had been cultivating. And if you think about him being a 22-year-old, nonetheless imbued with a lot of authority from the militia and from the governor of Virginia, the main person he was dealing with, the main authority figure amongst the Mingo allies, was someone named the Half King. That's the title he was usually known by. And he was kind of a mercurial figure. He was probably around 50 years old. And a very well-respected, well-known war chief in the Mingo. Although there is some thought that maybe he, on occasion, had done some double dealing. He didn't entirely trust the Virginia authorities, but he was, willing, and he didn't entirely, Half King didn't entirely want to abide by the authority of George Washington or even the Virginia militia or the governor of Virginia. The Mingo were kind of feeling the situation out for themselves. Okay, so a much older man, someone with his own sense of authority among the Mingo, and yet Washington, in his European and colonist perspective, is the person in charge of the Virginia militia. So there's this kind of loose coalition between the Mingo forces and Washington's Virginia militia forces. So nonetheless, they go together in 1754. And what happens is they get harassed by a French sortie, a French party who are also traversing this disputed territory, that disputed area that I was showing you. And what happens is in the progress, somehow the fight breaks out. Half King probably had a lot to do with it, and therefore Washington also had to back him up. And they end up killing some French in this party, including an important French officer named Jumonville. And this ends up being the skirmish. It's a very small skirmish, but the skirmish that ends up starting the conflict in North America. And so Washington immediately can perceive that this frontier area, it's something that he's supposed to survey. It's something that he is supposed to control by virtue of his power in the Virginia militia, but quickly it can get out of hand. And it's something that touches off what is immediately apparent is going to be a distinct conflict because the French start to pursue his party and it becomes really, really, really important. And fairly soon thereafter, in 1754 into 1755, Washington returns and he actually then gets enlisted as in his capacity with the Virginia militia as part of the British war effort against the French. So the conflict escalates from this small skirmish in the Pennsylvania frontier into a larger war in the frontier between the French and the British with native allies on both sides. And the French do fairly well. At first, they do very, very well. They kind of establish their control over the whole area at the Allegheny, the Monongahela, and the Ohio rivers. And they, in 1755, the British sent Major General Edward Braddock with plans for an offensive. And Braddock is something of a hero to George Washington, a man whose command he really respects. And what happens is Braddock goes and fights a pitched battle and is just routed by French sorties from Fort Duquesne, right there, in the outskirts of Pittsburgh. And Braddock himself is killed. And if you look at this portrait, you can also see I believe the sash, this kind of pink sash that, Sadie, you have to correct me if this is wrong, but I think this is right, that the pink sash that Washington is wearing in the portrait is actually Braddock's sash that was removed from his body when he was killed, right? And it's in the collection of Mount Vernon. Isn't that correct?
Yes, we actually have it. And I was actually really just thinking, I was like, man, I blew through that thing.
No, it's good. I was going to talk about it here.
But yeah, the sash, it's actually, officers would wear the sash because they were silk and you could carry them off the battlefield in them. And it was a prized collection. We actually still have it, in our collection.
Yeah, so I love that. That's a great example of what I'm talking about as a piece of material culture. And if you go onto the Mount Vernon website, and I think Sadie's going to share some resources at the end, they actually have video of the sash being unfurled, and you could look at it with students. You could talk about the material culture. So it's almost like a stretcher, right? I mean, that's what Sadie's saying, that it's a stretcher, but it's also a super powerful symbol. There's a reason Washington adds that to his portrait here. So he is identifying as a Virginia militia officer, but also as the assistant to a British commander and his British Major General. So the militia for Virginia being part of the British Empire, and he's wearing it basically in honor of his fallen commander. So you could think about him idolizing the chain of command and conceptualizing Virginia as an arm of Britain in this sense, and one that's going to go out against the French, against various native nations, and try to establish control. And in a way, it's bittersweet, right? Because he's remembering and he's associating with his body by wearing this sash. He's associating his fallen commander as an ideal to whom he could try to live up. And that, to us, this could be very, very interesting, a thing to explore with students, to think about George Washington, who himself is a huge martial ideal, right? He becomes the ideal soldier during and after the American Revolution, and his own military valor and his own abilities as a commander becomes such a part of his identity and his public reputation afterwards. And yet here we see him idolizing a British commander in exactly that same way. And so we can kind of see the prefiguring of martial value and bravery and even self-sacrifice, even to the point of death, as being values that are important to Washington. And that's something that he is depicting here related to the Pennsylvania frontier and in this presentation of himself as a militia officer. So you can kind of think about the way that this encounter and Braddock's defeat, it encapsulates the violence, the power contest, but also the personal and military identity of a person like George Washington. Again, he's 23 at that time, right? When in 1755, when Braddock is killed. So lots and lots of layers. And it's clearly something that still resonated with him long after, because he had it painted into the portrait and he preserved the sash. And it's still a part of the collection at Mount Vernon because it was something that was important to Washington for him to think about. So in the rest of 1755, the French severely damaged the British on Lake George in New York. In 1756, the war is formally declared in Europe, and we see it spreading from the colonies out to Europe for the first time. Oh, I was also going to show this. This is another excellent map to put in a plug for this kind of also zooms in on that the border between the Ohio Valley, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia. You can kind of see how it all fits together. And this is from the George Washington Encyclopedia, which is part of the Mount Vernon website and is an excellent resource for teaching and an excellent resource for students doing primary and secondary source research, because it's fully footnoted and also has lots of links to primary sources and things like this battle. So you can see the Battle of Monongahela, which is Braddock's army and Braddock's defeat as the inset here, but it also gives you a way to kind of zoom in on the beginning of the conflict as well as going on. So 1756, the French continue to do well. They capture Oswego and Lake Ontario, and they destroy Fort William Henry on Lake George. And in 1758, by 1758, the British Parliament has really taken notice, and they decide to end their previous policy of what's called salutary neglect, which is where they were not enforcing a lot of tax laws and other kinds of trade laws in the British colonies, but to basically start to commit men and money to the battle. And for a while, Washington, after Braddock's defeat, Washington sat out of the conflict before being brought back in towards the end of the French and Indian War. And Sir Geoffrey Amherst, the British send the regular British army to fight alongside the colonial militia in increasing numbers after 1758. And Fort Duquesne then in 1758 also goes back to the joint force, this time with George Washington as one of the commanders. And you can see that on this on the map. I think that, yeah, there's a friendly fire incident, and then the Battle of Fort Duquesne at September of 1758. This helped to turn the tide when Washington assisted with the retaking of Fort Duquesne. In 1759, the British started to do even better in the conflict. And that's key in 1759, because what happens is it causes the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee people to start, the Iroquois Confederacy or the Confederacy of Haudenosaunee tribes, to decide to switch sides essentially and start aligning themselves with the British. Not just directly because of George Washington, but because the British had started to really contend against the French. And basically the Haudenosaunee alliance decides that the British may be winning and they want to throw in with the British side. The British also use some better diplomacy than they had in the past. And Sir William Johnson, who is one of their main Indian negotiators, brings in the Iroquois and helps to capture Fort Niagara in July. And they have kind of a climactic battle after Ticonderoga and Crown Point are also captured. It goes through, there's a whole series of pitched battles then on the plains outside of Montreal in 1760. The British take Quebec in 1759, and then outside Montreal in 1760. And after a series of protracted negotiations, maybe we'll go back to this 1763, the 7 Years' War, which took 9 years, right? Not 7 years, was concluded in the peace of 1763. And so this is a place where you can see the before and the after, like an incredibly important, like the French are just their authority on the North American continent is greatly reduced, if not almost eliminated, right, in 1763, because except for a small area at New Orleans, which they then give to the Spanish, the French agree to capitulate, and Britain had ousted the French, the other great power on the continent. Now, what does this all mean for George Washington? Like, how does that tell us about how the frontier, and especially the frontier of Pennsylvania, affected George Washington? Well, George Washington felt as though, as did many, many colonial militia officers and enlisted people, militiamen, felt as though they had been part of the glorious British Empire, that they did a lot to maintain the British Empire and to defeat the French. And even felt, although George Washington had some doubts about this because of his early struggles with the Mingo, they even felt, excuse me, that they had the power to handle, shall we say, Native relations in the area. And so they felt that they were really like part of the successful team. On the other hand, the British were not so sure, right? The British Army was not sure that even people like George Washington, but definitely the general colonial militias, were not really they weren't up to snuff of the fighting force for the British Army. And so there's a mismatch in perceptions of what happened. And so after 1763, the other thing that happens, right, as I said, that the British start paying attention and spending a lot of money and men on the fight against the French, when they start to enforce taxes going forward in what we now call the imperial crisis, right, 1763 to 1775, that whole series of taxes on tea and paper and glass and lead and you name it, right, the whole acts under which they revoke a lot of colonial authority to do their own business. They mess with the very Virginia House of Burgesses that had given George Washington his commission as the Virginia militia. They try to remove a lot of their authority. They do that because the British government, rightly from their perspective, thinks they have invested all this money in preserving North America, and now they're going to use North American colonies to pay back some of that money, and even maybe some of the resources in men and material that they had sacrificed to protect the North American continent. But the militia doesn't see it that way, right? They see it as turning on a dime, betraying the values of British liberty and protecting the British Empire that they had done before. And that's one reason that George Washington himself actually converts relatively smoothly by the time of the 1770s. He ramps up his resistance to the British Empire in a way because the success in the French and Indian War for him initially confirmed his view of himself as a Briton and as a protector of Virginia on behalf of the British Empire. But because of the way the British government itself was changing its mind about how to enforce that power, he came to see that it was, in fact, more tyrannical from his perspective, that authority was illegitimate. First, that the Parliament's authority was illegitimate, and ultimately even that the King of England was illegitimate. And that their legitimate grievances of the colonists who had been promised the capacity to govern themselves and to do things like run a militia for themselves, that they were put at odds with the British Army instead of working together. And that is part of the disconnect that is going to cost this. In addition to which, there's a whole series of continued conflict. So for one thing, not all the Indian nations in this disputed territory, and even beyond the disputed territory, because you can see here, for instance, there are also forts in the British territory, in what we would see as modern day Michigan, for instance, that become part of Pontiac's rebellion, continued Indian warfare. And it's very clear, even though the King of England issues the proclamation line of 1763 that says, okay, we're going to just solve the problem of the frontier by not allowing any colonists to move west of this line in the Allegheny and the Appalachian Mountains. We'll just draw a line on the map and that'll solve it. Well, that doesn't satisfy George Washington. That doesn't satisfy the people who he was trying to protect, who wanted to move into that area, right? It's not gonna satisfy people in the frontier of Pennsylvania who already were colonists living there. And in fact, it doesn't do anything to pacify Native nations either, because colonists are already living in those areas and the British are not doing a good job of controlling the conflict. And so you can see that if someone like George Washington is already starting to question British authority because of a change of heart and a change of even though he had wanted nothing more than his own commission in the British Army, he can now see that that's not going to be possible, and that the British Army is working against the interests of Virginians instead of for the interests of Virginians. And when I say Virginians, I would include Pennsylvanians in that, and also frontier Virginians, frontier Pennsylvanians. And in addition to which, Washington, as someone who objected to this greater authority of the British Empire, found himself working with Pennsylvanians and found that he had a lot of common cause with Pennsylvanians. And when the Continental Congress starts to meet in Philadelphia, Washington becomes part of that. And he can see that in some ways he, as a Virginian, might have more in common with rebellious Pennsylvanians than he did with the British Empire. And it really fractures his sense of a man of the British identity, an officer of the British Empire. Okay, I'm gonna just take a deep breath there. It looked like was there some more chat, or were there more questions at that point about the way Washington's own identity was changed by the 7 Years' War, and the way that frontier Pennsylvania, in a way, led to him changing from being a very, very loyal British subject, someone who was enforcing British authority, into someone who fundamentally questioned British authority, and who was going to help to create a whole new way of looking at power on the North American continent. Were there other questions, or were any questions at this point?
We have a question in the chat. How does Daniel Boone's exploration west intersect with Washington and the British?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Mostly, Boone is most of his exploration, the bulk of it, I think, is a little bit later. It's the same kind of process. I want to make sure, because I'm not sure, what was he doing in the 1750s? That's a good question. Do you have, let's see, I'm not sure. I should know that off the top.
1769 is the date.
Okay, where he first started. That's interesting. He was also surveying, and he was someone who was legitimately trying to, he was kind of not as much interested in aligning with the British military as Washington was, but he was someone who was more directly working with settlers, so those people who are trying to settle in disputed territory. And in this case, it would be more like modern day Kentucky, like Western Virginia, right? Partly south of where Washington is. Of course, he did then serve as a militia officer. Boone was a militia officer during the Revolutionary War. So he does get involved in organized military forces, and he already had established himself, because he had established himself before the 1770s as an Indian fighter. I think he was taken prisoner by the Shawnee during the Revolutionary War. That's something that George Washington also does. He really promotes. So let me put it this way: Boone and Washington are alike in their exploration of the frontier and their clashes with Native peoples. I think Boone was more clashing only with Native peoples and not as much with the French before the Revolution. And then during the Revolutionary War, both Boone and Washington, were involved in the American cause. Boone continued as a direct fighter against Native forces in the Revolution, and Washington definitely very vigorously pursued warfare against Native American people during the Revolutionary War, and he sanctioned very scorched earth tactics. That's another thing he learned probably from the French and Indian War, was he was not afraid, and in fact was extremely assertive towards Native peoples. He endorsed, like I said, especially in upstate New York, not as much in in parts of Pennsylvania. But like Boone, he's not as much a direct Indian fighter in the Revolutionary War, but he does absolutely support that as one of the important tactics of the Revolutionary War. And then Washington, if you look at the period after the Revolutionary War, Washington very much pursued that kind of just past the area we've been talking about into the Ohio Valley with the establishment of the reestablishment of the United States Army after the Revolutionary War, and the sort of wiping out of. So first of all, the U.S. Army is defeated and then at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, defeats a Confederated force in the Ohio Valley, and the United States concludes the Treaty of Greenville under George Washington. So he's willing to use both treaties and continued warfare, and in fact reconstitutes the U.S. Army during his presidency in order to fight Native nations. Daniel Boone then, of course, converts to being kind of more of a someone who is escorting settlers and kind of engaging in partisan warfare. So they have different relationships to the governmental entities that are involved, first to the British Empire, the French Empire, and then to the United States government, right? There's a big difference between Washington and Boone after the Revolution, but they both, I would say they shared a lot of attitudes and a lot of tactics that they went through. Does that answer the question? Great. Jeff, other things?
Yeah, this is not yes, that does answer your question. I'm not an expert in this time period, but I understand that some of the fighting was done by essentially Scottish rebels that the king sent over and granted land. Basically, I will get these troublesome people out of my lands and tie them to those new lands so that I won't have trouble with them anymore.
Yeah, there's
Did that affect Washington's viewpoint, as saying, hey, we're a bunch of loyal British citizens here and he's dumping his rabble on us?
I'm trying to think if I have ever seen any comment from. I would put that in the category of the militia feeling that they were contributing and yet feeling that the British government didn't have great respect for them. I don't recall any time ever seeing George Washington specifically commenting on the Scotsmen as rabble or that they were a particularly troublesome group. And that might be there, but I'm not familiar with the sources of that. So I can't tell you that specific thing, but that kind of action did dramatize to him. So for instance, if you think of like Sir Jeffrey Amherst said that Americans, if left to themselves, would eat fried pork and lay in their tents all day. Or even James Wolfe, who was the great British hero and martyr of the war, said that provincial militiamen were, quote, the dirtiest, most contemptible, cowardly dogs you can conceive, and there's no depending upon them in action. And actually, even George Washington, I mean, he had a lot of failures, right? He had failures. He caused the war. He had failures of authority. Braddock's defeat is a failure. Like if viewed through British military eyes, you could see. Now, no one really called him lazy, but you get the idea that he wasn't just nothing but a success at the time. And so I think that mismatch, like that these British officers viewed the Americans as lazy and not very effective. And yet, as you're saying, they're also willing to like sort of mobilize troops that might not be from the most respected classes. That definitely could have had an effect. You see what I'm saying? That mismatch in self-perception is something that's going to be pretty important.
Yeah, thank you. Todd Boyer wanted to know if Washington ever came across Simon Kenton.
I don't know. That's a great question. I would have to look that up, and I don't. Sadie, do you know that off the top of your head? I really don't.
I do not, but I'll look up our records to see if we can pull.
Yeah, maybe you could look that up while we continue to talk. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry that I don't know that. I'm happy to admit when I don't know something. So. Okay, well, I think I'm going to move on for a minute and then just to talk a little bit about the other end of our chronology, the 1790s, and the way that frontier action shaped leadership and national politics after the war. And I can answer some more questions about the French and Indian War if people are interested at the end here as we go forward. But I want to say, and Sadie's going to have some more for us on the Whiskey Rebellion as well, but I want to at least get in a few points about the Whiskey Rebellion, because I suspect there may be Pennsylvania students who are interested in this. So looking again at a very similar space, but a totally different context now after the American Revolution. And think about how the frontier action, particularly in the Whiskey Rebellion, shaped Washington and his actions. And his concept, this time, not as much of empire and military action, but about national politics and military action. And so now we're going to look at Washington as president. So we left behind the 22-year-old militia officer, and now we're seeing him as president. We kind of cut to after the Revolutionary War. And he is unanimously elected in 1789 by the Electoral College to be the first president of the United States. And he was very committed, at least ideologically, we would say, to being nonpartisan. Now, it was easy to say that. He wouldn't have said that quite that way in 1789 because they didn't yet have political parties and they didn't yet have the idea of political parties. But to keep in mind that throughout his two terms, Washington was committed to being nonpartisan, and even in his farewell address right after his second term, he warned about the danger of parties and political parties in United States history, and thought that it was important for the president to kind of go down the middle and to be nonpartisan. So it's important to see that even in the beginning. However, right, we know that during his first term as president, nonetheless, no matter what he thought, almost immediately political parties started to form, the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists, and represented even in his own cabinet by Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, who became one of the prominent leaders of the Democratic Republican Party, and Alexander Hamilton, his Secretary of the Treasury, who became one of the most prominent leaders of the Federalist Party. And in fact, even Washington's vice president, John Adams, became thereafter a leader of the Federalist Party. And the two parties grew up out of a whole range of issues, many of them having to do with things like finance, right? Positions on banking and commerce, but also on issues that are really, really related to the frontier. And one of the things that's important now to realize about the Pennsylvania frontier in the 1790s is it's still seen as an economic resource. It's much more settled, but it is still an area prone to settlement. That same area around present-day Pittsburgh was still an area that was continuing to be settled. It was more sparsely populated than the eastern part of Pennsylvania. It had less representation in the Pennsylvania government and therefore also in the federal government that was created by the US Constitution, even though it was increasing in population rapidly, okay? And the people in the Western frontier were interested in economic activity, and they were interested in a lot of the kinds of actions going on in the national government. And remember, of course, that first New York and then Philadelphia was the capital of the United States, right, during Washington's first term. So very, very important. The two parties are also split, roughly the Democratic Republicans being more pro-French and the Federalists being more pro-British. That is exacerbated after the French Revolution really ramps up after 1789. At first, both parties supported the French Revolution, but as it grew increasingly radical and then increasingly violent, and certainly after they executed the King of France in 1793, the Democratic Republicans continued to be much more pro-French, and Washington and the Federalists the Federalists were not French, they were anti-French, and Washington declared neutrality in the war between France and Britain in 1792. So he was trying to keep the United States out of the clash between Britain and France. However, the Democratic Republicans claimed that that de facto meant he was more Federalist because the United States had aligned with the French during the Revolutionary War. And by declaring neutrality, they were saying Washington was de facto anti-French. One of the things that became increasingly clear as Washington's first term as president went on is that Alexander Hamilton had a lot of influence over Washington. This is something that distressed the Democratic Republicans. Thomas Jefferson actually resigned as Secretary of State, in part because he was sick of kind of having to toe the line against France, and he thought Hamilton was too influential. Several of Hamilton's financial programs hinged on the disposition of Western lands and also tax policies that influenced Westerners in Pennsylvania and Western lands particularly. Hamilton's financial program, which included monetizing Western land sales and an excise tax on whiskey. And what happens is the excise tax on whiskey is going to increase. He proposes the excise tax on whiskey to pay for the $42 million debt, national debt. And Congress agreed because they kind of could couch this excise tax on whiskey as a moral good. But the excise tax on whiskey, which was first proposed in 1791 during the first term as part of Hamilton's financial term, it fell particularly heavily upon Westerners. And particularly Western Pennsylvanians were in the lead of protesting this very, very early because it became an East-West issue because Pennsylvania legislators had gone along with the excise tax, despite the fact that not only did Western Pennsylvanians consume more whiskey, but they also produced more whiskey than Easterners, because it was very costly to convert grain and corn, to transport grain and corn to the East, to the trading posts. And they could make more money by converting that grain into whiskey and then trading it to the East in the form of whiskey. But so they felt that it was an unfair tax. And essentially they protested starting very shortly after 1791, when in September of 1791, an excise agent who came to collect the tax near Pittsburgh gets in a gunfight with some people resisting the tax. And they attacked a pony mail rider on his way out of town who narrowly escaped. There were threats of tarring and feathering. They tarred and feathered the excise agent, and they threatened the mail rider, which is a federal offense because they were interfering with the mail, the delivery of the mail. Okay, so it had to do with the collecting of the proceeds of this federal tax. And the problem is, they were pleading that this is essentially taxation without representation. The Westerners don't have enough representation. The Easterners have sold us down the river. And Alexander Hamilton has convinced everyone through this cabal, this is their idea, to put this tax on whiskey. And Washington is going along with it. Washington, who should be the protector of the people's interests, is absolutely going along with it. At the same time, you have the rise of Democratic Republican societies. Democratic Republican societies between 1791 and 1794 were political clubs. Many of them first founded in Pennsylvania, both in Philadelphia and in western parts of the state. He faced a number of these challenges, and between 1791 and 1793, these political clubs, which were coalitions of some middling and elite sorts, like lawyers and even some doctors and people like that, but also a very grassroots movement of farmers and working men, artisans, who thought that they would get together, and they called themselves Democratic Republican societies, in part because they supported Democratic Republican Party politics, in part because they tended to support the French Revolution, but because they saw themselves as gathering to protect the interests of the American citizenry. So you can see this quote, for instance, from one of the societies in North Carolina. It is the unalienable right of a free and independent people to assemble together in a peaceable manner, to discuss with firmness and freedom all subjects of public concern, and to publish their sentiments to their fellow citizens when the same shall tend to the public good. So they got together, they had protests, they had meetings, and in Western Pennsylvania, these Democratic Republican societies started to interface with these disgruntled farmers and townspeople who didn't want to pay their whiskey taxes. And this coalition of protests develops by 1794 into what we now know as the Whiskey Rebellion. And Washington, first of all, thought that these Democratic Republican societies were actually a threat to the US government. They were a potential threat to the US government. as he said here, can anything, this is first a private letter, but he says this later in many public speeches and forums. Can anything be more absurd, more arrogant, or more pernicious to the peace of society than for a self-created permanent body? For no one denies the right of the people to meet occasionally, to petition or to remonstrate against any act of the legislature, to declare that this act is unconstitutional and that this act is pregnant of mischief. He said this because Democratic Republican societies were encouraging protesters, and protesters in Western Pennsylvania were starting to do things like attack tax collectors on an everyday basis, and then to shut down the courts who were beginning to try them for attacking tax collectors and for not paying their taxes. And so Washington was saying, look, you people in the frontier, you people in Democratic Republican societies, even if you're in a city, but definitely in the frontier, you have the right to object when you think the government is being, you can remonstrate, as he says, against the legislature, but you don't have the right to declare taxes unconstitutional. And you don't have the right to shut down the courts. And you don't have the right to go against government officials. So he saw the actual authority of the US government and the US Constitution being threatened by protesters in Western Pennsylvania and elsewhere, but definitely in Western Pennsylvania. And so Alexander Hamilton is also outraged at this, and there's debate about what to do, but Hamilton convinces Washington, or Washington listens to Hamilton, to basically raise a federalized militia, which Washington then wrote out and reviewed at Fort Cumberland, Maryland in 1794. And then Hamilton led them to march against these whiskey rebels around Pittsburgh. What happens is mostly the rebels dissolve as soon as this army is raised and as they start to march forward. They do, however, go and investigate and arrest over 100 people, and in fact try and convict several people for treason, for treason, okay, for undermining the authority of the U.S. Constitution, for participating in these events. And ultimately, Washington pardoned, I think, 3 of the men who were convicted of treason. So it's interesting. He's so worried about these Democratic Republican societies and about these extra legal protests against a lawful government tax that he is not only willing to use government military force, the militia, also an activated citizenry, but to pursue actions of treason. But then ultimately, Washington also pardons men who were accused of treason. So he's trying to find some kind of balance about government authority. In his annual message to Congress, what we would call the State of the Union address, he's kind of trying to make peace. And he says, to every description of citizens, let praise be given, but let them persevere in their affectionate vigilance over that precious depository of American happiness, the Constitution of the United States. So Washington, one of the things I think, gets out of this issue of frontier protest is that protest is legitimate. Political organizing, we might call it, is legitimate. But when it gets to the point of threatening the constitutional actions of the United States government, it's a step too far. And he is willing to engage military force. And not only that, he's willing to engage military force in a way that opens him up to allegations of being a rank partisan and being a Federalist and supporting Hamilton way too much. And so even though he retires from the presidency after his second term, after the election in the election of 1796, his second term is somewhat tarnished by people calling Washington a partisan, and he's willing to risk his own reputation because he sees the protection of the Constitution as more important. Now, Jefferson and all of his foes, and actually many of the protesters in Western Pennsylvania, saw it as the complete opposite, that Washington was exerting unconstitutional authority by using the militia against his own people. And that was really the question. So once again, we can see that the frontier and like the spark of violence, especially in the frontier, is something that causes Washington's own reputation to be changed, and it causes him to examine this issue of government authority. And so I'm going to stop there. I think we have time for like one or two more questions before Sadie's going to show us some more resources about the Whiskey Rebellion. And that's a whole lot of stuff that I went over quickly. I'm sure you know more about the Whiskey Rebellion, and I'm happy to answer a question. Is there time for a few more questions, Sadie?
Absolutely. And we actually had one pop in the chat, and I was waiting to let you
Oh, good.
answer. But it was Judy was asking, was Washington close to Lafayette and the French in that regard?
He absolutely was. Washington was personally very close to Lafayette. Lafayette was he saw himself, and Washington saw him almost as an adopted son at times. They had been very close during the Revolutionary War. Lafayette was only 19 when he came and was commissioned Major General. They struck up a very close friendship. And in fact, in the early phases of the French Revolution, when Lafayette was revolutionary, right? He was supporting the French Revolution in the early phases, even though he himself was an aristocrat. You probably know this, Judy, that he helped to dismantle the Bastille prison, which is, one of the big events that touched off the French Revolution. And he mailed the key to the Bastille. He sent it to George Washington. It's still on the wall at Mount Vernon. And next time you go to Mount Vernon, you can go see the key to the Bastille, a gift of Lafayette to George Washington, because he said, this rightly should come to you as the father of liberty, and the protector of liberty. And in fact, it's actually one of the things that caused Washington to turn against the French Revolution and to declare neutrality, and probably de facto to listen more to Hamilton, who was even more against the French Revolution, because, of course, in the more radical phase of the French Revolution, the revolutionaries, especially the Girondins and then the Jacobins, turned against Lafayette, and he fled, and he was then imprisoned in a prison in Austria called the Olmütz. It was like in a dungeon for a number of years. And so the Washington was really concerned that they were going to execute Lafayette as part of that. So that's a great question, and one which I could talk about for a very long time, but I will stop there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. That was really great. I don't see any more. Did you see other questions, Jeff, in the chat? I didn't see any.
No, I didn't, but I did feel it. I want to make a comment, being that I'm in Carlisle, that Washington did review troops here as well.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I didn't have a picture of that one, Jeff. I meant to mention that he reviewed several different militia groups, but the most famous painting of one is in Maryland. I apologize. We'll need to commission an art piece immediately so we can depict the Carlisle review. I appreciate that. Maybe there's something at the one of the archives there.
Yeah, there is one. Hold on, let me see if I can find it.
Yeah, as he looks, I'll explain too. So there's even Washington, or Lafayette is so well known and celebrated at Mount Vernon. So Mount Vernon, the Washingtons, there are 10 bedrooms in this house right here that's right behind me. And there is no distinction of who slept where people did, except there's one specific note of the room where Lafayette stayed. So we actually know, and there's a commissioned portrait that Washington had done of Lafayette to hang in that room, because they were so close when he came back for that second time after the war to be together.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for showing that. Mort Kunstler is such an interesting artist, so I love that. It's a more modern depiction, obviously, but
well, just to give you a little bit of the history of this image, every year the War College class commissions a military painting that is their gift to the War College, and this was from the class of 1989.
That is so interesting. Thank you. I also think that Lafayette is another point of connection between Virginia and Pennsylvania. I mean, as Jacqueline was saying in the chat, Lafayette, like, you're right, he protected Washington at York, Pennsylvania, very important. And I think Lafayette's visit and affection for Lafayette is one of the factors that kind of connects some Pennsylvanians and Virginians kind of across that border. So it's definitely an important factor. And Lafayette's such an interesting character. There's a lot you could, great student projects can be born from that.
Absolutely. Oh, of course. And especially anytime you get to reference the Hamilton musical, with David Diggs' Lafayette, I think is always going to bring a smile to people's faces too. So, but thank you so much, Sarah. So now what I wanted to do is I just wanted to spend a little time because Sarah went over a lot of content. Oh my God, my face just got really big. I'm sorry. Sarah went over like a lot of really great content and background information of Washington and the frontier and how it shaped, and especially broke into that last piece on the Whiskey Rebellion, which was such a defining moment for Washington's presidency, right? It's that first really big challenge of the US Constitution and the role of the president in general and kind of the power of the federal government. And so what I wanted to do is I actually wanted to play a game with you guys. I don't know if any of you have played it before, but we have an online interactive called Be Washington. And basically they are 15-minute long video scenarios that play out 4 different real challenges that Washington faced, 2 when he was general during the Revolutionary War and 2 when he was president. And one of those is the Whiskey Rebellion. And so it's this great kind of introduction for all these big topics and these big themes and content that Sarah just covered. It's a really great way to kind of help the students, you know, at their level come into play to bring in all those important topics of when is the right to protest? What is the right way to protest? How is federal and state power being balanced in the early form of the government? So I'm going to share my screen and we're actually going to play the Whiskey Rebellion scenario. I'm like, fingers crossed, it won't be too glitchy. It won't, but it'll play for you guys. I've actually just spent the past 2 days playing this with 8th graders from Purcellville, Virginia. We did it digitally and they had some really awesome takeaways, and we can talk about that after we play it. But it's a really great kind of fun way. I'm just making sure I'm sharing my sound for students to get involved into the topics, because we're actually going to step foot into Washington's boots. Okay. Play here. You can see these different scenarios here. The Genet Affair, I just will give a little background. That's the neutrality crisis, but we had to think of a different name so we didn't spoil the ending. But we're going to play the Whiskey Rebellion. And actually, and if you guys would like, you're welcome to play along. If you don't, you know, and vote in the chat on which answer you think is true.
Stand back!
We'll not disband until you surrender that tax collector.
Colonel Neville is not here.
Then evacuate the property, lay down your arms, or suffer the consequences.
Sir, the local militia attacked the home of the tax collector last night in western Pennsylvania. They destroyed everything on his farm. Several people were killed, including soldiers from Fort Fayette who were defending the property.
I have endured protests and non-compliance from the citizens of western Pennsylvania for 3 years. And I fear it will not end with this.
What in the state of things is proper to be done?
Welcome to the Be Washington Interactive Theater. Soon, it will be your turn to test your leadership and decision-making skills in a crisis Washington faced as President of the United States. Here's the situation. In the summer of 1794, President Washington faces one of the first tests of federal authority. 3 years earlier, Congress passed a tax on whiskey in order to generate much-needed revenue for the new federal government. The tax threatens the livelihood of small-scale farmers in western Pennsylvania. who distill their grain into whiskey in order to prevent their crops from spoiling during the long journey to eastern markets. By the summer of 1794, tensions reach a boiling point when several U.S. Army soldiers are killed defending the home of the regional tax collector. You are about to step into the role of President Washington. As President of the United States, will you suspend the tax, let local officials handle enforcement, or use military force to quell the rebellion? Just like President Washington, you will have to make your decision under pressure as the situation continues to evolve. You will be able to seek advice from various advisors who represent people and sources President Washington would have consulted. But be aware, they will offer contradictory opinions and you will not have time to hear from everyone. It will be up to you alone to decide how strongly you agree or disagree with their advice and whether they will impact your decision as President of the United States. Now is your chance to be Washington. It's your turn to lead.
All right, so I'm going to start selecting different advisors for us to listen to.
As the designer of this tax, which is vital to servicing our national debt, the immediate question is whether the government of the United States shall ever raise revenue by an internal tax. The opposition has continued and matured till it has at length broke out in acts which are presumed to amount to treason. The army should be called forth and employed to suppress the insurrection. Whenever the government appears in arms, it ought to appear like a Hercules and inspire respect by the display of strength.
It is the very creators of this tax who have secretly stoked the fires of rebellion to advance their own power-hungry agenda for increasing the oversight of the federal government. These riots could have been avoided. This whiskey tax is unpopular in many parts of the Union, and you should not attempt to enforce it by rigorous means. Sir, suspend this unpopular tax.
The whiskey tax is the creation of sycophants and aristocrats who use the government to raise taxes to pay for their financial schemes. Rich men corrupt the government while poor men starve. Our hard work pays for their luxury. The whiskey tax is unfair on our labor. It is unjust in principle, oppressive in its operation, and impractical in execution. As a tyrannical tax, it must be immediately suspended.
Sir, Secretary Hamilton has sent you a letter regarding the situation in Pittsburgh.
Go on, Mr. Lear.
A body of 4,500 armed men has assembled in western Pennsylvania, about 9 miles from Fort Fayette, with the design of attacking the fort.
Death to traitors! Send the local tax collectors to the guillotines!
The bearer of the letters awaits your orders to return.
We must quiet the rebellion before it rips apart the Union. Notify the frontiersmen that we are sending a commission to mediate a peaceful resolution. In the meantime, all persons are to disperse and retire peaceably to their respective abodes.
A three-man commission is en route to western Pennsylvania to negotiate with the rioters. In the meantime, you have 2 new advisors to hear from.
We may have the right to send the army, but doing so could make the situation worse. The backcountry of Pennsylvania is a long way to take an army of militia, and there are tens of thousands of armed men in the mountains who have promised to resist. A resort to force will turn the local population against us and start a war. I prefer the complement of peace by every experiment of moderation. Let the local judicial authority run its course.
Sir, the state of Virginia is unanimous and determined to suppress that horrid insurrection in the state of Pennsylvania. A young man at Braddock's Field says there were not 4,000 men assembled there. There were not more than 1,000 guns among them, and if the ammunition had been divided among them, he does not suppose there would be more than one round a man. For my own part, I think it a very easy matter to bring these people into order. I don't wish to spill the blood of a citizen, but I wish to march against these people, to show them our determination to bring them to order and to support the laws.
Military force should only be a last resort. Experience encourages us to persevere in a lenient course. If a riot is committed, the rioters can be prosecuted. State officials are capable of prosecuting these violators. Every time riots have occurred in the past, the offenders have been indicted, convicted, and punished before the tribunals of the state. I beg you, let the local officials.
Sir, this letter from Attorney General Bradford just arrived from Pittsburgh.
What news of the commission?
The people cannot be induced to relinquish their opposition to the taxes.
The rioters in Western Pennsylvania will not compromise. Some have pledged to resist the whiskey tax at all costs. You may consult your advisors one last time, but make haste. You're running out of time to weigh your options.
Handle enforcement.
The excise law is a branch of the funding system, detested and abhorred by all small farmers. Should an attempt be made to suppress these people? I'm afraid the question will not be whether you will march to Pittsburgh, but whether they will march to the nation's capital in Philadelphia. I deplore the situation of this country. Should a civil war ensue, I earnestly and anxiously wish that a delay on the part of the government may give time to bring about, if practicable, good order and subordination. Stop the enforcement of this tax until Congress reconvenes and has a chance to consider repealing it.
Time's up. Your advisors have spoken. This is a reflection of how much you agreed or disagreed with their advice. As president, it's up to you alone to make the decision. Will you listen to the people of Western Pennsylvania and suspend this unpopular tax? Will you let local officials handle enforcement? Or will you use military force to quell the rebellion? You have 10 seconds to cast your vote, starting now.
You're welcome to cast a vote in the chat, A, B, or C if you'd like.
The results are in. The group is deadlocked. The votes are evenly split. Now let's find out what President Washington decided to do.
In obedience to the duty consigned to me by the Constitution to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, I do hereby declare and make known that I have summoned the militias from the states of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. They are already in motion to the scene of the rebellion. If the laws are to be so trampled upon with impunity,
There is an end put at one
stroke.
stroke to Republican government, and nothing but anarchy and confusion is to be expected thereafter. I warn all citizens who aid or abet the insurgents that they do so at their own peril.
President Washington chose to use military force. He personally escorted the army to Bedford, Pennsylvania. His decision reaffirmed the constitutional power of our new federal government to raise revenue through taxes, even if they proved unpopular in some regions of the country. The show of force was enough to quell the rebellion. President Washington's bold leadership ensured the rule of law and demonstrated that our democratic republic could withstand a domestic insurrection without trampling on the rights of citizens or descending into chaos.
All right, I'm gonna come back to the screen now. But I hope you all enjoyed that game. And it looks like our votes for our group together very much align with the voting of all time, where a lot of people tend to choose A, suspend the tax. But I love that you guys are humoring us with the votes. But B Washington, so that is such a powerful interactive, right? A great way to jump in and start many different conversations with students, and particularly as we're looking at it, as we're looking at it with the idea of the frontier, what takes place on the frontier and how the people living out there helped create the first real crisis of the US Constitution. And there are a lot of different pieces to break down within that, right? We talked about the crisis with the US Constitution. We talked about federal versus state powers and who has them, when is the right to protest, what rights do come with protesting. We bring this in a lot when we talk about Washington and leadership. All of those people, all of those advisors that provide insight are actual people that Washington would have either listened to or listened to personally, right? We heard from Edmund Randolph and Alexander Hamilton, generals that he was in contact with, but also reading about these opinions in the newspaper. So these are all different types of advice. Washington was very keen, both having military councils and presidential cabinets really help him understand the wider piece of information that's happening. So we get to look at the different types of leadership skills that he brings in on top of the conflict and what actually happened on the frontier, how this sparks, as Jeff just asked in the comment, could anyone but Washington have done that without sparking a wider conflict? And Sarah, I'd love for you to chime in on that too, to talk about probably not.
Yeah, probably not. I mean, I don't think so. I don't think, let's say, his successor, John Adams, wouldn't have tried it. He probably, Adams is more famous for restraining military usage rather than using military usage. I think if Jefferson had tried anything like that, I don't know, like turn the tables, if Jefferson had tried that, he might not have gotten away with it at the time. So I don't think anyone else at the time, even though it had an effect on Washington's own reputation, he had enough of the reputation as, as his interests being for the country and almost being synonymous with the Constitution that, and with the country that I think you're right. I think it's a really valid question. At the same time, I think things have maybe ebbed and flowed in decades since, that would be like a long debate about presidential power, I think. But certainly in the first decades of the United States, he was the one. That's the reason he was the first president, right? And I think because he was, because it was also dangerous, however, Jeff, because he was very committed to civilian control of the military, and he was very committed to occupying no, I just meant Jefferson, if there had been some other kind of conflict where Jefferson had let's say that there was some kind of protest over something he disagreed with. That's all I was trying to say.
Sure.
Yeah. So I just think that Washington was very committed to civilian control of the military, and he occupied the presidency as a civilian. He could have, the whole quelling of the Newburgh conspiracy, like he could have probably used his military reputation for a lot more power than he had. And I think maybe that also played a role in his getting away with this, because he had been willing between 1783 and 1793 to restrain a military power. And this was like the time he took it out of his arsenal. Does that make sense?
Yes. I mean, I was
Absolutely.
going to answer for Jeff. To me, it makes sense too. And I love I love this theme also too about frontiers that the National History Day is using. And the idea that frontiers can change over time, right? Sarah, you talked to us about how the Western frontier during the French Indian War, right? It looks a lot different than this frontier that Washington's dealing with, right? In the Whiskey Rebellion, right? So it's a lot different in how that idea of frontiers can be places, they can be people, they can be ideas. Because another thing we talk about when we show students and we work through this Whiskey Rebellion, where do we see this again? Right? Where do we see this continue or happening in American history, where a president is sending, the militia National Guard into the states to enforce state laws, right? How does this event that had never happened before, this challenge that Washington has to deal with, it's kind of this new frontier, but then it changes and other presidents after him look to that advice and look to that example, right? We talk a lot with students about the civil rights movement and Little Rock when they are trying to desegregate the schools, right? And Little Rock and the governor of Arkansas is not having it. And so the National Guard gets sent in, right? Because it is a federal law that state needs to be following. And so
Actually, Sadie, if I can clarify that, Wallace, not Wallace, I forget the governor of Arkansas. He sent the National Guard to prevent.
Right, yes.
Eisenhower federalized the National Guard, ordered them away, and sent the celebrated 101st Airborne.
Okay. Thank you for that correction.
Right.
Yes. And so, and so I just think that that's really cool. And I'm looking at Elizabeth's question in the chat of, do we have a worksheet or something like that for students to fill out as they work through? And we do actually. I'm going to use this then as a little transition if I can, because this last part, just these last 20 minutes that we're together, Jeff and I really wanted to talk through how do you get to use all this stuff in the classroom, right? It's great that we get to have Sarah here and have all this wonderful content. But then I also want to make sure that you understand that the job that Jeff and I have is to take all this content and put it into resources that can really impact the classroom, whether it's your teaching, whether it's the students' research for National History Day or other projects. So we absolutely have some great resources to show. And we do have on some of our pages, we do have graphic organizers for this Be Washington. And the graphic organizers are great. The students can go through and each advisor they're listening to, they get to rate how much they agree, how much they disagree with that advisor, what that advisor is pushing for. We also have great PDFs, printable, free downloadable PDFs of all the advisors. It's their original image. So it's a primary source image of who they were, and then their script from the interactive. All of it are footnoted with the original sources. They have vocabulary in them, but as a way for students to help pick out what was being talked about. It also, these advisor cards, and I'm sorry, I'm focusing on these for Be Washington, they also give individual descriptions about who the advisor was, right? Because we can also talk a lot of Be Washington about bias, because all those people gave Washington different pieces of advice, and there are reasons behind that, right? Why is Hamilton, the writer of the tax, really pushing that it stays, gets enforced, and Washington does everything in his power to make sure it lasts, right? Whereas the Governor Mifflin of Pennsylvania, why is he advocating that the states should handle this and not the federal government, right? So we're seeing we're looking at bias as to why people are making these decisions, but we do have resources for that on our website. I'm going to share my screen now because I am just talking at you. And all right, so if I share my screen here, I'm going to bring the chat over. I'll get my PowerPoint slide. And oh, good, it's going to play from the beginning. So we can go through, look at this wonderful Also, I'm sorry to say, I got too excited to listen to Sarah talk at her topic. So I didn't even show you the last piece that I wanted to show you, this portrait that you guys all knew was painted 20 years after Washington's time in the militia, in the British Army. And it was done as a prominent piece. This is the very first image we have painted of Washington. It was commissioned by Martha to hang in the front parlor of Mount Vernon. So in the most prominent place where well-known visitors are coming in. And this is a snapshot taken from our virtual tour that you can explore the house. So if you look on our website, I'm just going to really quickly talk through where you can find all these great things. Under our education tab on our main page, we have all of these wonderful sources all these wonderful resources, primary sources, additional resources, videos, and a whole special page dedicated to how much we love National History Day and want to support teachers implementing it, students using it for their research, and also just other students in general who have to do a project. This page, we put topic themes that we have come together that connect the whole of Mount Vernon. So George Washington, the enslaved community, Martha Washington, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, the museum that runs this. How do these topics connect? How do our subjects connect to the National History Day topic? And then more importantly, we link all those primary sources. We know that when students are doing their research, finding credible sources is really important, right? And sometimes it's difficult making sure that it's a credible place and a diverse set of sources. So we really value that we have so many to offer. We have documents, but primary sources aren't just documents, right? They're places, they're objects, they're artifacts, they're different entries in our databases. And so this webpage highlights all those great places where students can go. So you can see our archaeological and our curatorial collections to really help with that research. All of these are free. All of these are downloadable. All of these are easily searched on our website and can come back again and again and really help enhance different parts of students' research. We have, Sarah mentioned our digital encyclopedia. These are great summaries that if it's hard to jump right into a primary source or a topic, we have different articles and videos to help them get started. All of this is based in our research. All of this uses the source material that our scholars have, but puts it in more digestible bites. So intro videos, some summary articles, and then all of this culminates with, even if you guys aren't here because you do National History Day, that's fine. One thing I am here to really push is how much Mount Vernon, we love talking to our teachers. We love hosting these PD workshops. We're ready to start celebrating the students and build relationships with the students. And so we've recently launched a Mount Vernon Student of the Year Award. It's for any middle school student, any high school student that does any project throughout the year on George Washington. It can be a poster for his birthday that hangs in the classroom. It can be a speech running for for school office. It can be a documentary, a website. It can be anything. It can be a paper that your student does about George Washington. And it's a cash prize. That's the best part about it. Middle school students get $1,000. High school students get $5,000. The award nominations are open through the entire school year. So anytime a student does something, they can be nominated. They can be nominated multiple times. They can be nominated for group projects, and the teachers get $500. So hopefully you're paying attention and you support that as you think about how you're bringing Washington into your classroom, so that we can celebrate the students' hard work too, along with supporting the teachers. The nominations are open throughout the entire school year. They close at the end of May, and then the winner is picked in early June. But please do all of these resources. We really try to make sure that we're not just here for one-off moments of these wonderful PDs where we get to interact and share things, but we really try and make sure that our website is full of resources that are credible, resources that are original, that can be used in the classroom by students and teachers to really hype up any project that's going on. So I was going to show you mine. I'm going to toss it over to Jeff. Great question about, do students have to live in Virginia to win? No, this is a national award. So actually we've launched it 2 years ago, and we've had students, we had one in Virginia, Missouri, New Jersey, and Wisconsin have been our winners. So it is a national award open to anyone, middle and high school. And again, individual and group projects. They'll all kind of split those awards. And then we want to thank the teachers as well for their hard work. So that's one of our big pushes. And we think that National History Day is a great way into that. But Jeff, I'll stop sharing my screen so that you can start sharing yours.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. That's a tough act to follow, the two of you, but I'll do my best. So I want to tell you a little bit about the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center and the Army Heritage Center Foundation, a little bit about our resources, and a little bit about National History Day. That was the first time I've seen that being in Washington, the Whiskey Rebellion one. And I think, that's a tremendous thing to help students understand the concept of a frontier, because frontiers are places, and I think both Sarah and Sadie mentioned this before, but they're places where power is being negotiated, structure is being decided. They're places where the normal rules don't necessarily apply, and they may not apply for a variety of reasons. It could be that they're simply ineffective. It could be that they're unenforceable, and it could be that there are various people with various interests who don't want them to apply for a variety of reasons, among other things. There are also opportunities for change when things go through in a frontier. What comes out on the other side of the process may be very different about what came from before. So I just think that whole thing with Washington's options laid out for him is just tremendous for helping kids understand that. The U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center is part of the U.S. Army War College. I work for the Army Heritage Center Foundation. We are the nonprofit friends group of USAHEC. And our mission is to build the buildings, expand the campus, and enhance the programs here at USAHEC. USAHEC is part of the War College, and the core of USAHEC is really a very large historical collection. You can see here, I'm not going to read every bit of it to you about what its mission is. But I want you to get an idea of what a gem we have here in Pennsylvania in terms of this research facility. We have over 35,000 veteran surveys. Most of them are from Pennsylvania. These are documents that ordinary veterans have completed to document their history. We have over 327,000 books, 1.2 million classified documents. Basically, we have about 15 million documents, photographs, and artifacts related to the unofficial history of the United States Army. Periodicals, 23,000 linear feet of manuscript material, 600 oral histories. These materials are in the process of being digitized, and once they get them digitized and get the online catalog completely sorted out, these resources will be available to you and to your students. So it's a real tremendous opportunity for everyone. We also have an outdoor living history museum, the Army Heritage Trail, where we cover a lot of Pennsylvania's frontier history with our French and Indian War cabin. You can see that being constructed down here, and a frontier blockhouse and way station. in addition to other macro exhibits. We have several exhibit galleries, encompassing art and artifacts, and lots of other opportunities for education. As I mentioned, the foundation, we promote, build, and enhance. This is just an aerial photograph of the center to show how we're growing and what our resources are. So I'm the state coordinator for National History Day in Pennsylvania. And so I want to share a few resources that we have here that may be of value to you and your students. Let me just get this called up. Okay. To move this bit here. All right. So one thing that you may find interesting is our soldier stories. If you go to armyheritage.org, click on programs, there's soldier stories right there. I won't go into too much detail about these, but these are primary source based resources on soldiers for a variety of different periods of American history. The National History Day in Pennsylvania program, our website here, and you can get to it just pa.nhd.org. I will put that link in an email that we'll share with you after this program. But this is where you can come to get started. You can find your regional coordinator if you don't already participate in the program. And you can also look at the variety of program resources that are available. I point out the NHD rulebook because there are a surprising number of students who do NHD who have never looked at the rulebook. So I do recommend that teachers and students take a look at that. We also have a lot of judge and coordinator resources here, and we put these out here like our judges orientation, judges instructions. That's all there for you to share with your students so that they can see how they're going to be evaluated if they choose to participate in the contest program. Okay, so Ashley, I see your comment there. Just go ahead and send me an email. I'm happy to connect with you. Let's see, I think there was another comment there. That's not popping up for me. Okay. All right, Jennifer, you have to go to a meeting. Understood. One thing that's really important is research that we want to share with your students. And if you come to our website, which is armyheritage.org, go to programs, click on research, it'll bring you to this page. You can search the collection. You know, as I said, they're still getting the collection digitized, and they're still working out the search engine for it. So one thing that can be very helpful to your students are our reference bibliographies. So they click here, they get the reference bibliographies. It opens up this page. You view the bibliographies. It opens up this page. They can search by subject. They can search by unit, forts and camps, and biographies. We have tremendous resources as far as biographies are concerned. And I do want to highlight just this one, which is our bibliography for George Washington. And it's a 17-page document. So we have all sorts of resources connected to him. It's also significant to note that our rare book collection does include a number of books that were owned by Washington himself. When there was a fire at the Library of Congress and they lost a lot of books, Washington donated a significant collection, mostly books that he and Henry Knox had collected pertaining to all things military. Apparently, when he was when he saw the direction his career was going, he started laying his hands on every bit of military wisdom that had been committed to paper that he could lay his hands on. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. It's been a long day, but that is just an overview of what we have here. So if you are interested and want to find out more about these materials, the bibliographies are tremendous for your students because we do have the archival materials, which will eventually all be available digitally, but there's a lot of secondary source material there in those bibliographies that they can either get in their own libraries or through interlibrary loans. So those are very useful resources for that. But that's as far as I'm going to take it tonight. So I want to thank you all for your attendance. It was wonderful, fantastic presentation. I learned a lot. And hopefully we can do this again sometime. So we have about a minute left if anybody has any last minute questions for the panel.
Jeff, there was one in the chat that I'm going to answer
Okay.
about looking for a certificate. We have a template for those. If you'd like me to take that. If anybody who would like a certificate, I'm putting in the chat now, just email education@mountvernon.org and put that you attended this Washington and the Pennsylvania Frontier. And we'll put together that certificate for those 2 hours. So if you just want to email, it's education@mountvernon.org. We'll take care of that. You're welcome, Melissa.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. And a special thanks to Sadie. She's really the one who made this happen when she reached out to me and said, hey, we'd like to do something with you. And so if you enjoyed tonight's program, thanks, Sadie, for putting it, for really being the one to put it together.
Well, thank you for, agreeing to it and jumping right on board. And Sarah, thank you so much. A full day of teaching and then to come hang out with
Absolutely.
us.
It's all worth it. I love my K-12 peeps. So have a great rest of the school 2022 year.
Yes.
And we'll survive
Okay.
to 2023.
Enjoy that Thanksgiving break.
Yeah. And if you're in Pennsylvania, watch out driving home if you have to drive home because of the snow.
Get home safe.
All right.
All right. Bye, everyone.
So long, everyone.